We're going to examine the concept of mechusar kippurim, which means somebody who's gone through part of their purification process but hasn't completed it by bringing their karbanos, specifically in the context of a yoledis, a woman who has given birth. And we'll see that there's a three-way debate as to how exactly we should interpret her status before she's brought those karbanos. And that teaches us a lesson about how urgent it is for Hashem to get us out of galus, of all things. In Pasuk B'Sei Parshas Yoledis, towards the end of the section in this week's parasha that speaks about the tumah of childbirth, the pasuk says, "V'chiper aleh kohen v'tohera." The kohen will then bring the karbanos to atone for her and purify her. V'tohera, she will be, in the passive, purified. And the Gemara. So the Gemara interprets that to mean v'tohera michlal she tmeah. The fact that it says she'll be purified implies that up until this point she was tmeah, she was impure. In other words, as a mechusar kippurim, somebody who has gone through toveling in a mikveh and waiting for nightfall, but has not yet brought the carbon the next day, after they've been into the mikveh and they've waited for nightfall, before they bring the carbon, is tamei legabit kamedinim, is considered tamei in certain respects. We're going to look at three areas in which that tumah would apply. Number one, aleph. The first thing is, until that carbon is brought, the person is still restricted from participating in something which is kachim, in other words, a carbon. Number two, beis hamikdash is a chayiv misa. This is a severe one, that if a person as a kohen served in the beis hamikdash in that state of not yet purity, they would be liable for misa. Because the pasuk is, or the halach is, that an impure person who serves in the beis hamikdash, it is a capital offense. Number three, gimel as mechusar kippurim pasal di avoda. If such a person engaged with avoda, they would discredit the entire avoda. It would be voided. Okay, so as far as the Gemara is concerned, 100% in a state of tumah, at least with regards to these three halachas, until such time as the person has brought their korban. The Rambam in Sefer Hayar brings the drasha in Tzvei Erta. The Rambam looks at this pasuk and this concept in two different places. Firstly, he brings it in the context of somebody who's in the state of mechusar kippurim who served in the Beis Hamikdash, their avoda is disqualified. And Beis, as well as in the context of the prohibition against entering the holier section of the Beis Hamikdash in this impure state. The only thing is, he says the words a little differently to the Gemara. Ve'tohera, pasuk says, and she is purified. Michlal, that implies she'adayin lenigmara or gomra ta'arasa. That means that up until this point, where she's brought the karbanos, the purification process is not complete. A little different to what the Gemara said, she's impure. For Lashem Rambam is moving as the cheson for mechusar kippurim is nitazei machmas dem chiyuv from tuma. In other words, the way the Rambam is putting it, the obligations and liabilities of this person who hasn't yet brought their korban is not because they are pure, because they're impure. Rather, claim chochas durch dem was tovel on herav shimshei is givoren toher. Rather, what the Rambam is saying is, look, you've been through the process, you've been to the mikveh, and you waited for nightfall, so technically you are toher. And that affects certain practical things, like you're now permitted to eat truma. However, there are still the prohibitions against entering the Beis Hamikdash or eating karbanos, or the possibility of disqualifying an avoida, and therefore in that regard, the tumah kind of lingers in that regard. And the Pharisees that's why there are restrictions against participating in a korban or entering the Beis Hamikdash. But not dosis mitzad shliach hasarim betara. Even though he's not debating the halachic implications, but what he's saying is the reason for this is not because you're absolutely impure, but because there's still a lack of purity. Because you're missing the last step of purification, which is to bring the carbon. The Rambam actually says this pretty clearly at the beginning of this conversation. Why is it that a zava, a yoledis, or a metzora who have not yet brought the karbanos are called lacking kapara? Because all four of these, even though they have purified from tumah, so there you have it clearly, they're not in a state of tumah. Nevertheless, something's lacking, and the purification process is not yet complete to the extent that you could eat kachim or enter the Beis Hamikdash, and that will only happen at Shiavi Karbana till you bring the carbon. Until the person has brought that carbon, they may not participate in eating kachim. And he references the fact that he's already discussed this in the halachos of Psulei HaMikdashin. In other words, still says, this is not because the person is still technically tamei, because they're not, because the purification is not yet complete. Und der Mochach euch davon, was wenn wir gehen dem Israel kann es mit der lernen der Sabti Gemara von oid tum asay boy. And we can see this further because the Gemara says that the prohibition against entering the Beis Hamikdash is because oid tum asay boy, because the person still has tumah attached to them. The Rabbi Mechusar Kapara, which the Gemara says extends even to include the person who's been to the mikveh but hasn't yet brought the karbonos. Whereas the Rambam learned this up, Kanal from Pasuk v'Tahira. The Rambam learns the same halacha from a different pasuk, which doesn't emphasize the word tuma, rather v'Tahira michal shadain lagomer tarasa, that only after the carbon is she considered completely pure, implying that before the carbon she hasn't yet completed her purification process. And it's enough given and there will be a practical halachic difference between the angle of the Gemara and the angle of the Rambam. The Rambam learned Tasam Chosuk Kippurim is nit tame, because the Rambam's perspective is that the person who's already been to the mikveh can no longer be considered tame, even if they haven't brought the karbanos. It's just that they haven't completed the purification process. The Rebbe Paskin the Rambam as Chosuk Kippurim Shachal Kodesh Shimish is nit chay misa oikaris. Therefore, he argues that if somebody at this stage ate from a korban or they served in the Beis Hamikdash, maybe not in Eretz Yisrael, let's just say, they are not chayav misa. Mashengin the Ravad halt as Mechusar Kippurim is chayav misa, whereas the Ravad disagrees and says, in any case, when a person hasn't yet brought the korbanos, if they engage in any of the prohibited activities, they are chayav misa. And there's Masak if in Rambam, and he debates Rambam, and he says, V'ho amrina, b'im makas, didn't the Gemara say makas? Oid to Mosai boy the Rabbis Mechusar Kippurim, that he still has impurity, and that includes even the person of Mechusar Kippurim. V'oid v'toherak sibiyoledas, as well as the fact that it also says in the case of a woman after childbirth that once she brings those korbanos, then v'toherak she is pure. Michal, that implies that hashta to meyahi, that up until that point she is considered tamei. And then he brings a third proof. The Gemara Zvachim Mechusar Kippurim dezav. Kizav Dami, where the Gemara says that a Zav who has not yet brought his karbanos has the halachic status of a Zav. And the Tosefta on that subject includes that person as somebody who has transgressed a capital offense. So then, and it turns out that the Ravid's interpretation of this whole subject, as a Gerda from Mechusar Kippurim, means that the person who's been to mikveh but has not yet brought the karbanos is kapara is noch verblieben von der friedike Tumma. Unlike the Rambam says, it's just because you haven't completed the purification process. The Ravid says the person still has some tumma until they've brought the karbanos. As this place nifke geworden der chilek Tumma was auf me'akiv given achilas truma, and the only difference that will occur once a person has been to the mikveh without having brought the karbanos is that we relieve them of that tumma that would block them from eating truma. Okay, so what do we have? We have the Ravid's perspective of the Gemara, which is you still retain tumah. The Rambam's perspective, which is you just haven't completed your tara. Nafkamina between them is whether you chayv misa or not. Now we're going to focus, as the Rebbe often does, on Rashi's perspective. Rashi commenting on the Torah also brings this interpretation of the word v'tahira, implying that up until now she was not tahira. But look how Rashi says it completely differently. He doesn't use the language of the Gemara, nor does he use the language of the Rambam, so he has his language. V'tohera, now she's considered pure. Michal, that implies she'adkani kuruya tameya. That implies that until she's brought that carbon, she's called tamei. Interesting language. Not that she is tamei, not that she's lacking tara, she's called tamei. Now the fact is, Rashi clearly is using different language to the Gemara that said clearly, until now, she is impure. We have to explain from some Friedrich and Pirshev Diverti May Tahara. Let's go back to what Rashi said about the concept of the days of her purification, which means that after a woman gives birth, for the first 7 days in the case of the birth of a boy and the first 14 days for the birth of a girl, she's considered in a state of impurity. Then there are still 33 days in the case of a boy, 66 days in the case of a girl, before she's able to bring her karbanos, and that's called Yemei Tahara, the days of her becoming pure. Says Rashi, Yemei Toyar Shelad, this means the days of her purification process. And Rashi does not say that this is purity with regards to whether she's permitted to her husband or not, but uses a generic term. The days of her purification is Muchach. That indicates as that implies actually that on all accounts she's in a state of purification, even though she hasn't yet brought her korban. Those was the pasuk is mazir. The pasuk warns her, don't touch a korban, and don't enter the Beis Hamikdash until you finish the days of purity. That implies that maybe she is impure. So It's not because she's in a state of impurity. It's because there is another side issue, which is she hasn't completed the process by bringing all the korbanos. In other words, kumtois. Which means that Rashi's perspective, which as we know is the simplest understanding of the pasuk, is that tumas leider nifke geworden gleich nach design or yudalet yomim. That impurity, that is the impurity of having given birth, that ends after 7 days in the case of birth of a son and 14 days in the case of birth of a daughter. Now, if she's already not considered tumas later after 7 or 14 days, then for sure 33 or 66 days later, she's definitely considered no longer tumas later, even though she hasn't yet brought her korban, which will only be the next day. Which explains why Rashi will not use the language the Gemara used to say she is impure during those 33 or 66 days, because Rashi really doesn't see it that way. Rashi, that will also help us understand Rashi's comment in Dibra B'chol Kodesh on those words in the pasuk that says she may not touch Kodesh. Rabbi says that includes truma as well. As it only doesn't truma in the Lamed Gimel Yomim, that if she's married to a kohen, she may not eat truma in those 33 or 66 days. Wait until she can bring a korban. Lefi Rashi explains because it's essentially like one long Tvul Yom. Tvul Yom is you went to mikveh that day. You have to wait till the evening to be able to eat truma. For her, all 33 or 66 days are considered one long Tvul Yom that she may not eat truma. She went to the mikveh after 7 days. And then she has to wait for the sun to go down. Now, normally you'd wait for the sun of that day to go down, and that night you could eat truma. She has to wait for the sun to go down 33 or 66 days later. And then, and only the next day, after the sun sets, on day 40, then she'll be allowed to bring the korban that atones for her. And you wonder, why does Rashi have to stick that last part in? That the next day, she'll bring the korban that atones for and it purifies her. Now, the main Rashi to Zogan, it's very intentional. Rashi wants us to know. In the same way as if she wanted to eat from a korban after she's gone through all of those days of purification, if she wanted to eat a korban before she brought her korban the next day, so we know she's not considered tamei, but she's still not permitted to eat a korban. So the same kind of logic will apply to being permitted to eat truma in those 33 days. It's not because she's impure. She's not impure. At the end of 7 days for a boy, 14 days for a girl, she's no longer tmeya later. Was der Chiv Kaporas Tarosa haltet up und der Los nicht. As the Harav Shemesh von der Friedike Tag, it's just that she hasn't brought her korban. She hasn't brought a korban. Until she brings the korban, she cannot eat kachim. And the night before bringing the korban is the only night that will be considered the sunset that permits her to eat truma. And until that sunset of day 40 occurs, she's not yet permitted to eat truma. So Rashi has a very interesting way of looking at this. She's not tamei, but she's not yet permitted to re-engage in holy activities. And das ist der Achiluk zwischen L'shein Rashi before Shalat Torah and L'shein Hashas. That will explain why Rashi used language which is different to the language of the Gemara. Remember, this is Rashi al HaTorah, which means he's giving us the pshat. If I'm looking through the lens of the simplest understanding of the pasuk, which is what Rashi wants to bring us, you cannot call a woman who has gone to the mikveh impure, even if she hasn't brought a korbanos. Because the Torah told us that those days from day 7 or day 14 till this point, they are considered days of purity. Whereas the Gemara, which is looking from the perspective of halacha rather than pshat, those days from day 7 or day 14, they're actually considered days of impurity. How do I know? Because she can't eat truma. And therefore, until such time as she brings her karbanas, she's still considered impure to the extent that she may not eat kachim and she may not enter the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, so we have these three different perspectives. The Gemara saying she is impure until she's brought a korbanos. Rambam saying her purification process is not complete until she's brought the korbanos. And Rashi saying she's technically pure, but she's still called tmeya until such time as it's the night before the korban when she could eat truma. So it's one long full yom, and the next day she could eat karbanos. So now there's the other side of the angle that we have to understand. The Baldas Loit Rashi is the Tumas Leid Nifka Givar, and this is a very logical question. If Rashi is saying that by day 7 after a boy and day 14 after a girl, she's no longer Tameya, then it doesn't really seem to make sense that she should be called Tameya. She's not Tameya. Why would you call her Tameya? Rashi should have said, like the Rambam does, she hasn't completed the purification process. That would seem a lot more logical, no? Either way you look at it, doesn't seem to make sense. If you're going to say that the fact she hasn't yet brought her korban means that that's delaying the full extent of the purification, so if you interpret that to mean that she's not yet fully purified, then don't just say she's called impure. She's obviously impure. On the other hand, if you're going to say the other way, which is how we've explained Rashi, as the tum is nifka givorin, that after day 7 or day 14, the tum has been removed. Und das, was it doesn't kachim, is an isur tzedadi, and the fact that she still may not eat kachim, that's a side restriction. It's doch nicht kinyan from kriya to me, then it's got nothing to do with impurity. It's some other halacha. No, an isur lecha b'kachim, bring them korban. There's a separate prohibition against eating kachim until she brings the korban. So why are you calling her tmei? Therefore, let's move on. That implies, as a pshutish mikra, that if I'm taking the simplest understanding, is the get from Mechusay Kippurim by Yeledes, if I an oifen. There is general Mechusay Kippurim as it applies to a Zav, a Zava, and a Metzora. And then there is a third perspective on what it means to be Mechusay Kippurim after childbirth. The Tumas Leda is nifki geworden gleich nach die Shivas Yomim. Yes, the actual physical impurity of Leda, of childbirth, ends as soon as 7 or 14 days have passed. On the später Tag Zainen Yemetei Shalom, in the next 33 or 66 days, in the case of boy or girl, those are considered days of purity. On the Rebbe Kemenoi nicht sagen, she hit Tameya, and therefore there's no way that you could call her impure at that point. She's past impurity. But despite that, is that Tavas is also busy bring them korban. But now we got to ask the question: so why can't she not eat kachim until she's brought her korban? What's going on over here? That's not because she hasn't yet, like any other Mechusay Kippurim, completed a purification process till she brings the korban, which seems to be what the Rambam is saying. Rather, not it's something unique to being a woman after childbirth. In the specific case of childbirth, even when the tumah has been removed, the name tumah still applies because it's childbirth. She's called impure. And that's only going to be removed once she brings the korban to atone, which is also key information. And Rashi says this by changing the language on the Gemara and emphasizing. She's now considered pure. Michlal, that implies number one, that till now. Secondly, she's called tmeya. Those are important indicators. Why? Not like the Gemara that said, implying she's impure, without the word adkan, because Aleph these blows kruyot meya. Rashi wants us to know she's not impure, even though she's called impure. We'll have to understand why that is. And Beis Abadosa hemshach free adkan he kruyot meya. And he specifically says it's a continuation of what happened up until this point, which is that adkan, that previously she was in a state of tumah, and that impacts how she is now. What does that mean? So the we first have to understand why Rashi is taking this approach, seeing as he's looking at the perspective of Pshat. We'll see what's pushing Rashi to explain this by something else that Rashi said differently to the Gemara. In Gemara the Gemara, analyzing this concept that she's Tmeya until she brings her karbanas, that brings us from word v'tohera shebesim haparasha. The Gemara is commenting on that key word v'tohera, and she is now pure. Michlal, implying that till now she's Tmeya. The full phrase is the kohen will atone for her and she'll be pure. But Rashi is to say from Frieden Kapasik. Rashi brings the same insight as to at which point is she considered completely pure, and up until that point she's called Tmeya. He doesn't bring it on those words. But rather on the pasuk before, which says, she has to bring, or the kohen has to bring her korban in front of Hashem to atone for her, and that will purify her from the blood of childbirth. Now this is strange. Seeing as Rashi's argument is that up until this point of her bringing her karbonis, she's still called Tmeya, in other words, implying that it's not real Tumah beforehand, not blows a shame Tumah, it's just a title of Tumah which we still need to understand. The best place to explain that is V'tohera. She, look at the grammar, she becomes pure, implying until now she is called impure. And that would work much better than where Rashi does bring it, which is Vatara. That sounds like the action the Kohen is taking to purify her, especially since that implies purifying from impurity, which is not what Rashi wants to say. Rashi doesn't want to suggest that she's Tmeah, he just wants to say there's L'shoin Tumah. No, the beer in them, so the explanation is this. Let's assume that we didn't have that pasuk that says that the korban purifies her from the tumah. Then I would have thought, look, the Torah does say she's not allowed to eat kochim or enter the Beis Hamikdash. Let's focus on eating kochim. Must be for some other reason, not related to tumah at all. Now, sa'isa tzedodi, it's some other unrelated iser. And the reason for that issur would be because she's still lacking the korban she needed to bring, and therefore unrelated to tumah, she's not allowed to eat kochim. But because the Torah emphasizes that she's been purified from the childbirth, so that what's the Torah telling us? It's not only that she may not eat kochim because she hasn't technically brought a korban. There's something about her status. She still retains some level of impurity associated with a childbirth. Now, how do we work this out? You're telling me for 33 days she's already considered in purity days. And now you're telling me that now at the end of those 33 days you have to purify her from childbirth, but she's already pure. That's what leads Rashi to say, well, obviously, she's still called Tmeya, even though she's not actually Tmeya. And even though the Tumah has been removed, but the name Tumah still applies to her, and we have to ask, why would that be? So, something's still unclear over here. First of all, why is Rashi getting into this? Rashi's objective in his book is not to explain the reasons behind halachas. Why is it going to help us understand the pshat of the pasuk to tell us, as a to tell us that the reason she can't eat kochim till she brings her korban is because she's called tmeya? So what? All we need to know is, may she or may she not eat kochim? That's pshat. Why? That's the halacha. Subject for somebody else to investigate. And secondly, maybe even a stronger question, base. If the tumah has been removed after 7 or 14 days, why logically would she still be considered tmeya till she brings her korban? There is no tumah. Why call somebody tmeya if they have no tumah? So we'll answer that by dealing with the biggest question here. The Rebbe has told us numerous times that Rashi's job is to address any glaring questions in pshat, the simple understanding of the pasuk. The glaring question here is, how come Rashi doesn't discuss the idea that one of the korbanos that a yoledes has to bring is a korban chatas, to atone? Atone for what? What did she do wrong? What affair has she transgressed that she needs to bring atonement for? That's a question that has to be addressed according to Pshat. In fact, many of the commentators on the Torah raise this question. Why a korban chatas? It's a beautiful thing to have a child. And if you think that Rashi doesn't get into the question of why people have to bring certain korbanos, go back to the beginning of Vayikra with the korban oila, where he asks exactly that. The Torah tells us that when a person brings a korban oila, it will be accepted to atone for him. Rashi asks, atone for what? You're bringing a korban oila. Well, what's it atoning for? And then he goes on to explain, alav shanita klase. He explains what categories of misdeeds a korban oila would be mechaper. In other words, Rashi does want to understand why there's kapara associated with a korban that doesn't seem to have anything to do with kapara. Kal v'chomer, in the case of a yoledus, which seems to have nothing to do with anything wrong, why would there be atonement? Or poshet, as McKenna talking about Rashi philosophy in Gemara, and we'll go without saying that Rashi's not avoiding discussing this because he knows that you've already learned the Gemara. How would you have already learned the Gemara? Because the Gemara explains that at the time of childbirth, a woman swears she's never going to have another child. And that's why she has to bring a korban chatas. Rashi can't be saying pshat based on something that's in the Gemara. He doesn't even allude to it and say, check the Gemara here, as he often does. Therefore, we have to say, that the child who's 5 years old, based on what he's learnt until now, and Rashi's insights on Chumash until now, already understands, based on Pshat, based on something that he's already learnt, that there is a reason for a korban chatas with regards to birth. And by the way, it has nothing to do with this possibility that you might swear she's never going to have children again. So, Shas men learnt. Now we're at this parasha and we're learning that a woman gives birth, and she has to be impure. And that impurity is similar to nida. So we're learning this parasha's yoledes, the parasha of the laws regarding childbirth. So what should first come to mind is look at the description of what childbirth is like and be reminded that there's pain associated with childbirth, and where did that come from? In Parshas Bereishis. Was the Eibishter gesagt haben, back in Parshas Bereishis, after the Chet Eitzadas, where the Eibishter said to Chava, noch ihr Chet be'itzadas, because she did something wrong. Ali Isha Omar, the Eibishter told her, I'm going to increase your pain and distress, and it's going to be a painful experience to give birth. Every single birth, which follows a pregnancy, which is also an uncomfortable experience, is an anoifim von He's going to include the discomfort of pregnancy, and it's going to have the pain of childbirth. Why is that? Why is there pain and discomfort associated with pregnancy and childbirth? Every single childbirth and the pain associated with it is linked to the punishment for Chet Eitzadas. That would explain why there's tumah associated with childbirth. Nothing to do with anything that this mother has done wrong. Rashi points out, by the way, that even if, however it happens, there's childbirth without blood, you would think blood is the source of the tumah. Childbirth has its own tumah. Why? How would it have tumah if there's no blood? Because the fact that childbirth is painful because of Chava's engagement in the Chet Eitzadas. So childbirth brings impurity because of the Chet Eitzadas. Now we can understand logically why a woman after childbirth has to bring a korban chatos. Because every single childbirth with every single woman has some residue of the Chet Eitzadas. You have to atone for that. And it's not atone for what you did, atone for what happened all the way back. And this is not dissimilar from every Avera, actually. As Rashi already explained to us about the Chet HaEgel, the Eibishter says, on the days that I make a reckoning, I will also include Rashi explains, include what? Then whenever Hashem takes a cheshbon of our Averas, there'll be some element of Chet Eitzadas that the Eibishter includes in the reckoning of any Avera that a person does. And there's never punishment of the Jewish people that doesn't have some residue of the punishment of Chet HaEgel. So now we have a completely different understanding of why there's such a thing as Tumas later and why there's a korban chatas after birth. It's to do with Chet Eitzadas. Now, now that we understand what the core cause of Tumas later is, now we can understand, going back to what Rashi said about bringing her korban to purify her. So Rashi says that what does v'hikrivo mean? The person who's coming to atone, the tara is dependent on them. In other words, as die Tar von der Isha Yoledes ist tolle Dafkin dem Korban Chattes, was kommt der Kapara nicht in der Oila. She brings two korbanos when she has to purify from childbirth. One is a korban oila, one is a korban Chattes. Rashi says it's the korban Chattes that brings the purification for her. What's the link? Because now we understand. The reason there's tumah associated with childbirth is because of a misdeed which requires atonement. So therefore, how do you purify from that impurity with something that atones? Because the cause of the impurity is an avera, so therefore the clearing of that impurity is something which is kapara. Now we can understand Rashi's perspective on this purification. Straight after Rashi explains that point, that it's the korban chatas that purifies her, he links her purification to kapara for chet eitzadas. Then the next thing that he says, not waiting for the word later on, v'tohera, right away he says, it's a mamshich. Torah, she's purified. That implies that until she's brought this korban, she's still called Tmeya. Now that we appreciate that the reason is Tumah in the first place with childbirth is because of Chet Etzadas. Und der Reber is ir Tara verbunden mit ir Kapara, and therefore the purifying of this woman is a factor of her Kapara. Kapara of Etzadas. That explains why she's called Tmeya, even if she's not physically Tumah. We've removed the Tumah, practically. Because man, sie hat noch nicht ihr Kapara. But as long as she hasn't yet had her personal Kapara for this experience, she's still carrying the name of impurity, which is associated with the pain of childbirth, which is associated with the Chet Etzadas. That would explain why Rashi is explaining something which does not seem to be pshat, that until now she is called Tmei. Let's assume that the reason she was not allowed to eat kachem is just because she hasn't technically completed the process of purification, nothing to do with Tumah. Well, then the woman might not feel any pressure to sort out this korban to be able to eat kachem, because who says she has any kachem to eat, maybe even for months? Generally speaking, if you're not a kohen, you're not required to be in the state of purity to be able to eat kachem whenever they become available. Except when you're going into Yom Tov and you're going to have to bring various karbanos, then you have to be in a state of Tara. So there's no urgency if it's just a matter of being permitted to eat kachem. There's no urgency for her to bring her karbanos. That's why Rashi has to explain to us the reason why she is still considered Tameya up until this point. The fact that she's carrying the title Tameya and the reason she's still carrying this title is because she hasn't yet atoned. That's personal. I'm carrying something negative and I need to atone for it. So needless to say, she has to sort that out ASAP, because nobody wants to carry the load of some kind of negative energy, even if it goes back to Chet Etzadas. Chazal sagen, here's the lesson for us. Chazal tell us, as the Eibishter only tells us to do things if he himself does those things. Es ist davon verstandig, als geschehen wie der Eibishter will, als Signen sollen nicht sein, in einer Masse von Kryo Bilvad Tmeya. This parasha illustrates to us that not only does Hashem not want us to be Tmeim, but he doesn't even want us to carry the name Tmeya, and we should have an immediate resolution for this, to atone and to clear that designation of Tameya. The Eibishter treats us the same way as when man is begolus, and when we're in a state of golus, which means we are called Tameya because we're distant from the Eibishter. Okay, Psakdin Rambam, and as the famous ruling of the Rambam, as Yeder Eid b'chol mokim b'chol zman, that every single Jew, no matter when is Ritzoynev al pi Toras Emes. Toras Emes defines that his truest will is Torn nor Ritzoyn Hashem. What's to do with the Eibishter ones? Oh no, and if a Jew ever does things contrary to what the Eibishter wants, that is as nor mitzad oines. That's because of external pressure of the Yetzer Hara. And especially after the incredibly overwhelming difficulties and decrees and destruction that the Jewish people have faced, the Moshiach was in seinen Schein durchgegangen, the birth pangs of Moshiach that we've already been through, especially in recent times. Nehmt der Eibishter raus die Eden von der Maim in der Matze von Kriya Tmeya. The Eibishter wants to get us out of that situation where we are called Tmeya. We're not Tmeya. Internally, we're aligned with the Eibishter. V'chas v'shalom zu sagen, as Emetzer oder Epes keinem Akiv sein. Chas v'shalom, anything could interfere with the Eibishter's plan to release us from being called Tmeim. And it's come Jesus achi gedolan. In the same way as that woman has to go out and get her Tara ASAP, the Eibishter wants to move us out of Golis in the fastest way possible. Will nur as bei ihnen soll ich sein die Chukai Pariskan Jesus miyad. The only thing is that the Eibishter wants us to wish that we could get out of the Golis as quickly as possible. Like we teach this woman, she has to want to get out of Tumah as quickly as possible. Meloshan Rambam, the miyad, which is the language of the Rambam from Golis, should get out of Golis immediately. From the Matzav and Kriya Tmeya and Kumala Gamata Rosan Kaparosan, all we need is to really want to get out of Golis and really want to be in a state of atonement and purity. And through that, when it's come to Gula in an Eifen von Barum and Anashmaya, that will bring about the kind of Gula which is supernatural, Moshiach coming out of the heavens, Achishena, and they were just speeding up the coming in Achishena, even speeding up the speeding up, Miyad Mamash Bagoli Didan, and the Gula should happen absolutely immediately.